Great. Well, welcome everyone. Yes. Welcome to our seminar series from the Intentional Communities Network. This is our third seminar. We run seminars monthly at the moment, and we're kind of halfway through a 6-monthly program. And we're mostly academics exploring intentional communities globally, although you don't need to obviously be an academic to come and watch us. And there's going to be further information. We have an Intentional Communities website, which will be linked to the bottom of this recording for you to have a look at what else we have going on. And of course, if you're watching this and thinking that you'd like to share your work with us, then obviously please do contact. It's currently organised by me, Jenny Pickerell from Sheffield University, and Kirsten Stevens-Woods, who's not here today, at Cardiff Met. So we'll have about a 45-minute, 60-minute talk, Carlotta, depending how you're getting on, and then we'll have a Q&A. So please, if you've got any questions, please put them aside while we're going to hear the whole talk, and then we'll ask the questions. So it can be a bit disrupting if there are comments going on as well. So please mute and listen. I'm really excited to introduce Carlotta Molfese, who's going to be speaking to us about Back to the Land movement as prefiguration, advancing a less anthropocentric framework. I'm particularly excited because I have already, a few years ago, read her PhD, which was amazing. So I continue to follow your work with great enthusiasm. And I particularly love the way in which you're able to focus on and bring in the more than human into a field which has been very human-centric for far too long. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you also to Kirsten for inviting me and for the opportunity to share my research. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you see that?
We can now, yes, perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, so as Jenny was saying, today I present my research into the Back to the Land movement, and I focus in particular on the theoretical framework I developed to examine the prefigurative politics of this movement. And I imagine that some in the audience are familiar with the Back to the Land movement or variants of it in the form of eco-villages, eco-communities, and intentional communes. And alongside these more collective or communal initiatives, the Back to the Land movement is also often understood through the lens of prefigurative politics as experimental spaces or prefigurative examples of more sustainable ways of living, and one in which farming or working the land is a prominent concern. In fact, scholars of the movement like Keith Alfakri and Andrew Wilber argue that it is precisely in this interaction with the land or nature that the radicalism of this movement lies. And by this, they mean relations and practices that engage a modern human collectivity composed of materials, natural elements, seasonal cycles, plants, animals, soils, and a lot more. However, as I argue in this presentation, the way prefiguration is currently theorized does not allow for these modern human beings and agencies to be actually recognized as significant actors within the movement. They're generally framed as either tools and resources or as passive material backgrounds on which prefigurative politics takes place. And yet, in the context of the Anthropocene, we're being invited by many schools of contemporary thinking to look for the prefiguration of other worlds, not just within human societies, but within modern human assemblages. And the framework I propose uses modern human perspectives to rethink prefigurations in less anthropocentric terms. And it does so by foregrounding and attending to the agency of place and non-human beings in the becoming and doing of Back to the Land farmers. To ground this conceptual framework, I draw upon my own autoethnographic journey back to the land, and I explore the role of affective experiences, encounters, and everyday doings with the land and modern human beings in shaping the subjectivity and everyday practices of these radical farmers. Now, broadly speaking, the Back to the Land movement is a movement of radical environmentalists who migrate to rural places and take up farming and other land-based activities as a way of living. Outside the Anglophone world, terms such as new farmers or new peasants are also used to foreground the importance of land as a resource base for their livelihoods, but also to distinguish them from more traditional and entrepreneurial farmers. Now, Back to the Land farmers are generally associated to the counterculture of the 60s and anarchist variants of radical politics. They're basically environmentalists that want to materially and spiritually reconnect with the land and natural cycles. They have an interest in growing their own food organically and a passion for and commitment also aim to distance themselves from authoritarian and capitalist logics and structures, and they embrace ideals such as anti-consumerism, meaningful work, voluntary simplicity, and self-sufficiency. Now, many scholars of the Back to the Land movement have had difficulties in locating Back to the Land farming within a familiar political landscape, wondering whether it can even be considered a movement or if it's just a collection of spatially diffused individual initiatives. Moreover, the strategy of withdrawal from mainstream society, often referred to as dropping out, as well as their focus upon the private sphere and the lack of formal political affiliations and collective organizations, have also raised critiques of lifestyle politics, meaning these initiatives are considered to be too small to bring about change, and they can be easily co-opted by the capitalist paradigm that they oppose. Now, within modern environmentalism, the Back to the Land movement is in fact quite unique in its ideological beliefs and practices. Unlike forms of environmentalism that seek to protect a wilderness devoid of humans, or forms of direct action activism like marches and protests, Back to the Land farmers immerse themselves in the modern human community of a rural environment to try and translate their values and ideas into forms of everyday living. And they do so through the development of environmentally embedded and generally self-reliant living patterns, which may include the creation of low-impact dwelling, the use of green technology and off-grid energy systems, the adoption of permaculture or other organic methods of farming, as well as the development of do-it-yourself skills, communal work relations, and living arrangements. Now, to frame their political radicalism, Andrew Wilber suggests considering Back to the Land as a process of seeding alternatives. He says, through the literal act of seeding, Back to the Land farmers aim to create something both new and different. On occasion, this desire for change may be limited to personal lifestyles, but in many cases, it speaks to issues of social and economic organization, the nurturing of the environment, and a sustained creative appreciation of Earth's edible bounty. He also notes the types of alternative infrastructures related to food production and distribution that Back to the Land initiatives assist in creating, like food cooperatives, collective buying groups, alternative food markets and magazines, and more. Others have also framed communal Back to the Land initiatives like eco-villages and intentional communes as examples of sustainable societies or experimental alternative spaces. What these studies suggest is that instead of challenging authoritarian and capitalist structures directly, these radical farmers aim to create workable alternatives by connecting their political ideals and goals to actual everyday practices. And this alignment of mean and ends and the construction of alternatives is a key characteristic of prefigurative politics. Now, prefiguration as a concept and a political practice has multiple origins and genealogies, but much of the current literature and actual practices draw from anarchism. And prefiguration is basically about enacting future visions of the world into present practices. And some of you may be familiar with a range of prefigurative movements of the 90s and the early 2000s, like the Zapatistas, Occupy, the global anti-capitalist movement, as well as intentional communes, squats, and social centers. Basically, these are spaces of experimentation in which resources are creatively reused, skills and experiences are shared, and new structures of decision-making, production, and reproduction are organized and tested. Now, unlike the concept of resistance, prefiguration captures forms of political praxis beyond the openly oppositional and antagonistic. And it embraces a radically different political ontology that challenges many binaries of modern political philosophies, including distinctions between micro and macro scales, private and public spheres, strategies of revolution reform, or slow versus fast change. For instance, by grounding politics in the sphere of everyday life, prefiguration challenges the distinction between activists and ordinary citizens, as well as private and public spheres. Prefiguration, though, is primarily a place-based form of political praxis that emphasizes long-term development of good practices within particular projects, and so is often guided by the specific needs, circumstances, and goals of collectives. And even though this everyday and place-based focus makes prefiguration subject to critiques of lifestyle politics, prefiguration also implies a conception of politics as an experimental process with multiple forms and directions. And it also rethinks social change as being evolutionary rather than revolutionary, meaning it is a cyclical process that needs to be continually reinvented according to specific contexts, inequalities, and goals. This being said, the concept of prefiguration is also grounded in modern political philosophies that have emerged during the Enlightenment period and that rely upon nature-society binaries, including the separation between the subjects of politics, humans, and the objects of politics, non-humans. For instance, prefiguration is tied to modern notions of political subjectivity, which presume a rational human individual and connect political agency to an explicit element of intentionality. Moreover, prefiguration is generally understood as a matter of alternative values and practices, a form of cultural politics in which everyday practices are means to inscribe human intents and goals on a passive material background. So basically, this framing leaves non-humans as objects of political actions. They're either tools and resources that bear instrumental value to humans, or they're homogeneous and passive backgrounds on which cultural and political struggles take place. Even Andrew Wilber's interpretation of back to the land farming is largely in line with this conceptualization. For him, the material form of a back to the land farm is an indicator of both intent and practice, an evolving landscape design that actively contests conventional or modernist understandings of how rural space should be used, and a site at which alternative understandings can be given material embodiment. Now, if we follow relational and performative ontologies, then materiality is neither a tool nor a mere effect of human agency and intentionality. As Karen Barad puts it, nature is neither a passive surface awaiting the mark of culture, nor the end product of cultural performances. Instead, it is what she calls intra-activity, through and through. So by abstracting prefigurative subjects from their more than human worlds and denying the latter any agency, current conceptualization reproduce nature and society as two separate ontological categories. They present a world made up of conscious and acting humans on one side and unconscious and passive humans on the other. Now, addressing these conceptual limits is important not just for theory's sake, as forms of oppression, exclusion, exploitation, and commodification are often mediated by the material world, and they extend to and often intersect with the lives of non-human animals, plants, landscapes, and ecosystems. So remaining within anthropocentric framings works to reduce political possibilities by making invisible the becoming of modern human collectives and efforts to contest intersectional injustices and build more convivial ways of living in a modern human world. So in the remainder of this talk, I discuss a theoretical framework that addresses some of the limits of current prefigurative thinking, employing modern human perspectives and my own autoethnographic journey back to the land. I start first by focusing on rethinking the subjects of prefiguration using post-phenomenological reading of subjectivity and intentionality, and by taking seriously the agency of place as more than human actor. As I noted earlier, prefiguration is tied to modern notions of political subjectivity, which presumes a rational human subject with intentionality. However, intentionality itself is often assumed rather than empirically investigated, and it is largely treated as an ideological abstractions that pre-exist fully formed within individual subjects. Similarly, place holds an important role in prefiguration, but it has barely been considered as analytically significant in most studies. In other words, current thinking of prefiguration has given little consideration to how places, material arrangements, and affective relations may shape prefigurative subjects' goals, intentions, and efforts. So rather than denying human goals and intentions within prefigurative politics, I suggest a less anthropocentric framing that accounts for the role that non-humans play in the formation of subjects and their intentionality. This framing takes seriously the role of embodied experiences and affective encounters with more than human others, and it rethinks intentionality from a property pre-existing individuals to an emergent relation with the world. Additionally, and drawing upon indigenous ontologies and understandings, I consider place to be more than a site of engagement or an arena of action. I consider it to be an active participant in the becoming world of human subjects, with non-human beings and inanimate forces playing a creative role in the making of their intentions and actions. So, in my research, I have explored, in the first instance, the process by which individuals become back to the land farmers, meaning how their radical subjectivity, including their goals and intentions, emerge and are shaped by the wider field of modern human relations in which they are situated and entangled. And to do so, I analyzed the events and encounters that led to my own journey back to the land from the UK to southern Italy. And I traced how my intentionality to migrate and become a farmer came about, paying attention to biographical entanglements, social spatial dynamics, and affective experiences. So before moving to rural southern Italy, I lived with my partner for 3 years in a small community of New Age travelers and road protesters in the British countryside. And sitting around the campfire, I was introduced to the history of land struggles in Britain. I learned about alternative knowledge systems and ways of living, and I began becoming interested in alternative forms of agriculture like permaculture and agroecology. There I met people that moved and inspired me, and I gradually learned to be affected by their beliefs and values and their ways of living and knowing. During this time, I also built and lived in a low-impact dwelling in a woodland. And over time, I tuned my body to its cycles and rhythms, and I developed emotional bonds and connection with its more than human inhabitants. Initially, it took me a while to adjust to my new living conditions, like cooking and washing dishes outside, keeping the burner going overnight, washing myself with buckets, and walking around with head torches at night. But in time, I came to cherish my new home and these everyday routines for the moments and encounters that they offered me, like falling asleep to the calls of owls, or harvesting vegetables I planted for the first time, breathing in the aroma of wild garlic in the early spring, and foraging for wild currants in the woodland understory. So after a while, I did not wish to exchange any of these experiences and encounters for a hot shower, and that's how significant they were in shaping my becoming. So the experiential knowledge I acquired by experimenting with, with alternative ways of living in this community was not just about new practical skills and competencies, but also about novel affective dispositions and sensibilities. However, our relationship with the wider local community had always been tenuous, and planning issues eventually caused our eviction from this place. And we decided to move to southern Italy, buy some land near to where I grew up, and try to build an agricultural livelihood there. But my journey of becoming did not stop with our arrival in Italy. Here too, my intentions and goals were affected and shaped by the agency of the place we moved to. Most importantly, encountering a highly degraded soil, clashing with productivist farming cultures, as well as meeting economic constraints and institutional barriers, influenced our initial goals and disposition. These encounters forced us to slow down and refocus our efforts on soil restoration and the building of collaborations with alternative farming movements in nearby cities and towns. In other words, they compelled us to attune our intentions and plans to the place's own needs and potentialities, to understand what the place could afford us to do and how we should go about it. So intimate relations, radical connections, and affective attachments and disattachment to a rural place were all essential to the growth of my goals and ideals, as well as my intention to become a farmer. So I show how my journey back to the land did not start from one day to the next, but it came about gradually, and it was intimately entangled with the humans and non-humans I encountered along the way. And I argue that it's not just rational choices that drive these radical migrants, but also emotions and affective connections and disconnections with the more than human worlds they encounter and inhabit. So I show that the goals and intentions of back to the land farmers do not pre-exist fully formed within individual subjects, but they emerge within the flow of everyday life and across their biographical entanglements with people, places, contexts, and affective more than human environments. Intentionality here is an embodied act itself, not an ideological abstraction or a purely rational process. So the less anthropocentric framework I'm suggesting here is a reworking of notions of prefigurative subjects and their intentionality in terms of a processual becoming with, foregrounding more than human agencies and challenging narrow understandings based on ideas of fixity, coherence, and rational instrumentality. Now, some studies have already begun to foreground the importance of emotions and affects in the formation of political identities and networks. This framing adds to this literature by foregrounding how the ways in which place and non-humans have the capacity of making others act, by shaping their affective dispositions, identities, and intentions. Now, as Michael Carolan in this quote reminds us, taking seriously these bodily and affective connections is not just a theoretical exercise. Attending to the more than human and more than rational of prefigurative subjects by placing them within a field of more than human relations can make visible the histories, experiences, and encounters that have transformative power. This line of inquiry can allow us to better understand how radical subjectivities get formed, what kind of encounters, experiences, and affects move and mobilize people, how they learn to be affected by others, what makes them want and seek change, and what feeds their desires, intentions, and political imaginaries. In other words, Attending to the growth of prefigurative subjects can contribute to a better understanding of what might be needed to cultivate new imaginaries, sensibilities, and subjectivities in and for a modern human world. Now, in my second line of inquiry, I moved on to rethinking the political agency and transformative potential of prefiguration by shifting attention away from individuals and their practices to forms of life and their infrastructures. Now, theoretical consideration of prefiguration often associate the concept to practices, to the doing of things, and how these are guided by alternative values and ideals such as autonomy, solidarity, and justice. Now, these alternative practices are the means through which goals and ideals are given material embodiment. But this framing leaves non-humans as objects of political actions, and it treats back to the land farming as a lifestyle based on a set of indifferent practices that are detached and disembodied from the modern human worlds that these farmers inhabit. By reframing political subjectivity as becoming with more than humans, we can also decenter individuals and their practices and focus on forms of life, meaning ways of being, doing, and knowing that emerge and are performed with a modern human collectivity. So unlike a lifestyle, which is based on a logic of choice that separates the subjects from the objects of their doing, I argue that a form of life is based on a logic of care, in which a subject's value, knowledge, skills, and practices emerge from and are performed with a modern human collective. In other words, a form of life is a mode of existence that grows in and with the modern human worlds one inhabits, and which guides and constrains its development. Now, following this framing, prefiguration is no longer a matter of giving embodiment to one's intentions by inscribing them onto a passive material surface, but it is about crafting alternative life worlds of existence with a modern human collective. Prefiguring these forms of existence requires both severing some ties with capitalist entities, logic, spaces, and temporality, and experimentally recomposing and reorganizing social material existence in and with places. This ontological rearrangement is facilitated by the crafting of infrastructures, which I understand to be not mere materials or technical systems, but social material assemblages themselves, and which emerge from specific contexts, communities, and relations. They involve non-human beings and materials, but also humans, their values, knowledge, skills, and practices. In this relational understanding, the agency of infrastructure or their world-changing capacities cannot be reduced to humans alone. So rather than giving material embodiment to human designs or ideas, infrastructures are themselves constitutive of worlds, actively contributing to the production of spaces, subjects, modes of production, and inhabitation. So to pursue this line of inquiry, I approach back to the land living and farming not as a lifestyle, but as a performance of a way of living based upon ecological care and self-sufficiency. I paid attention to the values, knowledge, skills, and practices of back to the land farmers as they emerge and are performed with the various non-humans that constitute their domestic and farming spaces. So I attended to the doings of back to the land farmers with the land, the infrastructural arrangements these everyday interactions give rise to, and the transformative potential that they engender. In my journey back to the land, trying to prefigure a way of living based on ecological care and self-sufficiency started by trying disconnecting from corporate state infrastructures for water, electricity, and heating, as well as from farming technologies and actors like agrochemical companies and their products. At the same time, it has also involved observing and attuning to the place we move to try and meet our everyday needs with the resources available on the land or as close to it as possible. And this process has required learning about the place, social and natural history, its modern human ecology and seasonal cycles, as well as experimenting and enrolling various materials, technologies, and non-human beings in our everyday life. Now, this disconnection and reassembling of relations, materials, and energy flows in farming and domestic spaces gave rise to two infrastructural arrangements in particular, off-grid and mulch. And I'll briefly explore both in turn. Now, assembling and living with off-grid infrastructure was about trying to weave our life and everyday activities with the naturally occurring movements of energy resources and with the technologies available to harness them and incorporate them into our everyday life, like building a compost toilet and reusing our human manure as fertilizer to return carbon and nutrients back to the soil, while also conserving local water resources, which are scarce. It has also required participating with and learning from non-human others and elemental forces, experimenting with different spatial and material arrangements, and developing new skills and sensibilities. For instance, drawing water from a well required learning how to wire an electric pump into a battery array, operate and modify a pressure gauge and switch, plumbing and fitting connection, as well as learning to work with the slippery agency of water, its thermal mass in a black pipe, as well as the force of gravity. Similarly, setting up a wind turbine required navigating laws of physics and wind dynamics and learn to build with them. So composing and living with this infrastructure has taught us new skills, and it has compelled us to adapt our everyday routines and behaviors around, for instance, weather conditions and seasonal cycles. So using high energy tools and appliances when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. And this process has been and continues to be a learning and experimental process that has involved multiple trials and errors, constant readjustments, a lot of work, and also some compromises. But it also provided opportunities for learning, for being creative, and to be more connected, aware, and involved with place, as well as more sensitive towards everyday needs and comforts. Now, the other infrastructural arrangement, mulch, emerged from the need to disconnect from external farming inputs and productivist logics to try and restore a highly degraded soil and grow food organically. Now, composing mulch entails the gathering of different organic materials from the local area, including cow manure from local farms, cardboard boxes from local shops, soil straw from the chicken pen, as well as wood chips made from our own tree pruning. However, the decomposition of this infrastructure also relies upon the work of millions of organisms in the soil. Communities of bacteria, protozoans, nematodes, fungi, and arthropods shred, chew, and digest these organic materials, and they transform, transport, and exchange them across a vast network of microscopic life in the soil. And it is through this more than human co-performance of composition and decomposition of mulch that soil fertility is grown. So mulch has allowed us to integrate available organic resources and byproducts back into production processes to fertilize crops, intercept and hold water, suppress weeds, protect and nourish soil communities. And in so doing, it has also allowed us to reduce our dependence on external actors, including state and non-state infrastructures for water and other inputs. However, by sustaining soil ecosystem and their wider webs of relation, mulch has also created the conditions for the reproduction of other forms of life on the land, from fungi and bacteria to plants and animals. As enacting always reminds, making worlds is not limited to humans. And in the process of mulch decomposition, other forms of life move in, and they add to the agroecology, creating more diverse and complex food webs in which many besides humans can actually live. So mulch can also lead to interspecies experiments of more than human landscape making, where not only humans, but entire agroecologies try to transform the conditions of their shared existence. Importantly, mulch decomposition diffuses agency among different entities and processes in in and above the soil, and it shows transformative potentiality to be a relational matter dispersed in the connection and labor among people as well as other kinds of beings and things. So the infrastructures I have briefly described have allowed us to sever some ties with corporate state infrastructures and to reassemble our bodies and everyday lives and ecologies to perform ecological care and self-sufficiency. The agencies involved in this way of living are more than human. There is solar panels, batteries, water pumps, compost toilets, trees, cover crops, chickens, animal manure, worms, fungi, and so many more. But they're not objects or tools of an alternative lifestyle used to challenge unsustainable cultural norms and capitalist structures, but rather they are key participants in the making of a way of living, shaping the intentions, knowledge, skills, and practices of back-to-the-land farmers, as well as their domestic and farming spaces. So assembling this way of living is as much about disconnecting as it is about reconnecting, in the sense of cultivating awareness of material interdependencies and developing careful and responsible practices with a modern human collectivity. So this theoretical reconsideration frames the political radicalism of back-to-the-land farming from a form of lifestyle politics that deals in alternative identities and practices to a form of ontological politics that engages in the crafting of alternative ways of being. Now, the larger theoretical shift I'm suggesting is an understanding of prefiguration that goes from a form of cultural politics in which material, sites, and everyday doings are inscribed with alternative meanings and values, to a form of ontological politics that engages in the reconfiguration of bodies, spaces, and their relations through infrastructures. So prefiguration here means co-fabrication, an experimental and ongoing process of mutual becoming and doings of people, places, and material environments. So this framing does not deny humans political agency, but it does redistribute it across wider spatial temporal context and modern human relations. Agency here emerges through complex processes of co-performances and co-becomings. And transformative potentiality does not lie exclusively in the intentions and activities of humans alone, but in the relations, work, and effects of people, places, and things, as well as the infrastructures that they co-create. Now, crafting alternative modes of existence within a capitalist world is far from simple, and many prefigurative initiatives like Back to the Land Farms face many constraints, including access to land and resources. They also necessitate a lot of time, skills, and work, and they often face economic insecurity and marginalization. Nevertheless, in the context of the Anthropocene, this framework can allow us to glimpse into the cracks and make visible those experiences and experiments of co-becoming and co-doing that are envisioning and enacting modern human futures differently. So to conclude, the framework I presented builds on modern human perspectives to rethink the subjects and agency of prefigurative politics. This conceptual framework contributes to a less anthropocentric understanding by placing its subjects and its politics in the modern human worlds that they emerge from and are entangled with. The subjects of prefiguration are no longer materially abstracted and corporeally disembedded humans, but they are embodied and emplaced forms of life that grow from and are entangled with the modern human worlds in which they dwell. Most importantly, this framing does not treat the modern human world as a thing over which humans struggle or as a passive background on which this struggle takes place. Instead, it builds upon and enacts a relational approach in which all kinds of bodies, humans and non-human, are participants in changing the world. To capture the actors and agency of these modern human co-performances, it suggests the concept of infrastructure as a form of doing with more than human others that changes subjects and worlds. This framework can assist in making visible the histories and systems that exploits both humans and non-humans, as well as those ways of living and infrastructures that build the world otherwise. So following anthropologist Tim Ingold, this framework recognizes that we do not change the world by impressing our preconceived designs and ideas onto a passive surface, but that we partake from within in the world transformation of itself. And with this, I thank you for the attention. And I'll stop sharing. And maybe I'll turn a light on because I'm going dark.
Thank you, Carlotta. Fabulous.
Here we go.
And would you like to stop the recording before we go into some questions? Yes. That would be fabulous as well. Thank you.